Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. On today's episode, we're going to take a closer look at methamphetamine and fentanyl and how these two drugs have taken over America in just the past 5 years.
Today, a look at meth, a highly addictive stimulant that can also cause long-term heart and brain damage, as well as violent behavior. And there's been a massive spike in deadly meth overdoses in the United States over the last year.
It's more addictive. It's causing more paranoia.
In a high school in Hollywood, a student found dead on campus after apparently overdosing on drugs.
Two 15-year-old girls who authorities say bought the painkiller drug Percocet from someone in Lexington Park, overdosing at Helen Bernstein High School in Hollywood. Investigators believe the drug was likely laced with the more powerful narcotic fentanyl.
And Sam Quinones is my guest. And Sam is one of the great journalists working today. Now, I've read Sam's stories for years when he was at the LA Times, but it was actually a piece that he wrote for LA Magazine last October that completely blew my mind. It was about the connection between homelessness and drugs. And for the first time, I felt like somebody was writing honestly about this issue. And it was the first time I was finally able to better understand just what is happening in Los Angeles and in big cities and small cities across the country in terms of the uptick in crime, mental illness, the encampments, homelessness. That article caused me to pick up Sam's latest book, which is called The Least of Us. And I couldn't put it down. In the book, he traces the origins of fentanyl and of meth, and how these two drugs have become so pervasive and so lethal over the past few years. Now, the details that Sam uncovered in his book were really alarming and really enlightening in a lot of ways. And if you are as confused and upset and conflicted by what you see around you in cities these days, what you read on your next door feed, Sam's book is a real eye-opener. So Sam and I had a really great conversation. We open up with a brief sketch of his fascinating career. He's always reported about people on the margins of society, from street gangs to taco vendors. He spent much of his career in Mexico. Then we talk about his most recent deep dive into understanding the origins and the destructive path of meth and fentanyl. And as I said, he reveals some things that you may be surprised you haven't heard before, but that you certainly won't soon forget. It's pretty heavy stuff, but definitely worth a listen. So, without further ado, I bring you Sam Quinones. Sam Quinones, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Great to be with you, Jonathan. Thanks very much.
If people are not familiar with your writing, you are really one of the best. And I'm excited to be able to talk to you. I loved your new book, The Least of Us. Read the whole thing, listened to it in my car, on my walks. It was both, and hopefully there's a little little hope at the end there.
Right, indeed.
Because so many of our listeners are aspiring writers themselves, you have such an interesting origin story and such an interesting career. I just kind of want to take us through it a little bit in the beginning here. You are a California native. I was interested that you kind of started sort of your professional career managing punk bands and doing that kind of thing.
Well, I did that during college.
Yeah.
And I would say that I was very much into punk rock. This was the late 70s, early 80s. I produced concerts at a place where I was living at UC Berkeley called Barrington Hall, very notorious co-op. I would say that later influenced me. That whole punk rock idea of just doing it yourself,
right?
Not waiting for permission or just doing your thing and not waiting for someday I might do it, but doing it right then. And that really influenced me quite a bit, and really I think has been kind of the theme of a lot of my journalism career too. It's in that I've been a freelancer for about as long as I've been an employed journalist. And it just feels to me like the proper place for me to be, which is where I am now, again, on my own, freelancing and so on. And so, yeah, I did that then. And then I later on got into journalism. I didn't study it in school at all. I got a job at the Stockton Record covering crime. That was amazing. That was a wonderful job. That was like my grad school. I was writing 4 or 5 stories a day.
Wow.
For 4 years. And you do that and you very quickly, you can leave there. I left there really feeling confident that I could pretty much write anything. All of it was on deadline and so on. And it just made me into a better writer. I had some very good editors and so on. So throughout really my career, I've been very blessed with some really terrific top flight editors. And so all of that kind of created my journalism career in a sense.
Why crime early on?
I was writing for the Orange County Register, but for a weekly section, and I did not think that was good enough training. So I began to apply for daily jobs. And literally the truth is that the guy who had the job at the Stockton Record had been arrested and did 5 years in prison because he was had a bad cocaine habit and also was a flasher.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And so they had an opening,
so to speak.
I had read an article in Editor and Publisher magazine of what a great news town Stockton was. So when I was looking around for daily jobs, something would really challenge me, I thought, well, I'll apply to Stockton. And Stockton called up, said, yeah. And I went up there and very quickly started working for them. And it was the best decision of my life. I left the Orange County Register, which had at the time was like this, really up and coming newspaper and big color presses and all this kind of stuff. And I went to Stockton, and it was really the best decision ever, one of the best decisions I ever made, and just learned so much. And from then on, really kind of just determined that my career path became really much more than anything just a crime reporter.
Yeah, you seem to have an interest in writing about people who are on the margins of society, right? You went down to Mexico at some point in your career. You hung out with like street gangs and
that was where in Mexico, that was all because I was a freelancer down there. Mm-hmm. And in Mexico, they don't really know what freelancing is. It's not the same idea as up here. And certainly nobody in power is going to be calling me back. They'll call the New York Times reporter, they'll call the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, whatever. They will not call me back. And so I did not find myself it just was very difficult to find stories in the corridors of Mexican power. So the idea was then I don't really want to be there anyway. I don't feel very comfortable, there. I don't like wearing ties and all that. And so I began to focus my journalism far away from the corridors of power in Mexico City into the small towns, states where there was lots of immigration, covered a lot of immigration from Michoacan, Zacatecas, Oaxaca, Sinaloa, Guanajuato, different states like that. But really most of my journalism career was determined by the fact that I was an outcast too, in some sense, in that I was not going to get access to power.
Right.
And I was going to be on the margins too. And I preferred to be that way anyway, because the stories were so much better.
Yeah.
Out there in the middle of nowhere, And I wrote my first 2 books in Mexico about Mexico, and the first one and the second one was about Mexican immigration.
Was there a lot of danger? I get this sense. I mean, our impression in America is that it would be dangerous. That would be a dangerous beat.
No, it was not at the time. But see, my time there ended by coincidence, just as the drug war was about to erupt. And I could not do the job that I was doing for 10 years down in Mexico, which was basically getting on buses and driving and going out to these small towns and doing stories about immigration or whatever. On my own, no car, nobody to back me up, just me. Very little in the way of expense account too, by the way. Then I leave in 2004 and come back to Southern California, where I'm from, and get a job at the LA Times. And the next year, the drug, violence just erupts and gets worse and worse every year. And I watched that with horror because I had been to many of the places that were now places you could not really safely visit, particularly like, for example, the state of Michoacan. Michoacan I've been to maybe 30 times in various parts of the state. And it's not possible to do that now, and has not been possible to do that for a while.
Any colleagues that were killed or?
Yes, Phil True.
Wow.
Phil True from the San Antonio Express, wonderful guy, murdered most likely because he may have been taking pictures up in the core, what was it, the Huichol area, kind of a native people up there in the mountains of, I believe it was Jalisco or Nayarit. And maybe somebody who got upset. I'm not sure. I can't remember the details, but yeah, he was murdered, but it was a very rare thing. And now, of course, there's many, the last 15 years, it's been far, far more common for journalists to be murdered in Mexico. Most of them, of course, Mexican, not American, but nevertheless.
So you wrote your book Dreamland, which covered the opioid epidemic, a huge bestseller. So now you have this book that you put out last year called The Least of Us. Tell us a little bit about why that book came about, because you covered the opioid epidemic in a way that people hadn't been, so to a real deep dive into why this happened and how it happened. And then you kind of turn your eyes more to now fentanyl and methamphetamines. Talk about why you decided to write the second book.
Well, I think initially I didn't want to write the second book because I was thinking old school and I could not understand, this was early on, right after Dreamland came out. They wanted me to write another book. And I was thinking, but what could be worse than heroin?
Yeah.
And then along the way, what happened is I began to get lots and lots of invitations come speak all across the country for Dreamland. And as I was speaking, I began to see this new drug world, a totally different story, although connected to the earlier one, evolve. And largely because the Mexican trafficking world had figured out that it was far better to make your drugs with chemicals rather than grow them. So the synthetic era of drug production was in full swing by about 2018. And you saw methamphetamine and fentanyl really taking over where that had not been the case before. It was connected in that a lot of to the opioid thing, and that a lot of the people that they were selling to were people who were already strung out on pain pills and then graduated to heroin and so on. But it was also very, very different because it was no longer, the supplies were now from the underworld, the drug world in Mexico, no longer doctors and legitimate pain sources and all that kind of stuff. And also, it seemed to me that the trafficking world and dealers down at the lower levels too, of course, saw this as this is basically a story of supply creating demand. And just this time, it had been with the opioids too, but at this point, it became so big just from the underworld providing so much of these two drugs, just staggering quantities of these drugs that you just never saw those kinds of, and I believe we're in a historic moment, really, where one source, the Mexican trafficking world, has covered the entire country with not one but two of these drugs, and that's a remarkable achievement made possible only by the fact that they make their drugs. There's no seasons, make them all year round, and they have access to all the ingredient chemicals they would ever need through two ports on the western side of Mexico, and probably also the Mexico City airport, of course. But basically, they just have almost unlimited access because of the corruption in Mexico and a variety of other things, the guns that come from here that arm those guys, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, basically, it means the reason for being able to do that is that they just get access to all these ingredient chemicals. And now many, many, many people, particularly on the western side of Mexico, now know how to make these drugs. It's widespread knowledge base.
So let's talk about fentanyl first. For a while, and I don't know if this is true anymore, in your book, you say that a lot of that drug was coming from China, right?
Yes,
like
initially.
So let's take me back a little bit. So what is fentanyl?
Fentanyl is a great anesthetic invented in 1960 by Paul Janssen of Janssen Pharmaceutica in Belgium. Magnificent drug, revolutionized surgery, made a lot of surgery possible, very potent, and also has one reason it's such a helpful anesthetic is because it takes you in and out of anesthesia very quickly. You don't have hours and hours doped up like with morphine and all that. Very quickly, you get in and out of it. And it was also extraordinarily potent. Janssen knew this. He thought he protected against that by only allowing people in anesthesiologists to use it.
Yeah, you said early on the anesthesiologists were the people that were the addicts.
Yeah. In the United States, that was true because we did not have the controls. I think the controls that Paul Janssen wanted were not as present, say, as they should have been. And so fentanyl still, though, becomes this revolutionary drug, and then is adopted occasionally by an occasional underground chemist, makes a little batch. It gets out there, a few people die, and then it gradually, though, the Chinese chemical companies begin to figure out that there's a market. They make fentanyl already, but they figure out there's a market for their fentanyl in the United States among people who were selling opioids, who were selling pain pills and heroin and that kind of thing. And the first area they begin to service really primarily were the areas where the opioid epidemic had hit worst.
Right.
And that would be Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana, Tennessee, stuff like that. And the Chinese get into it, cover that region with this fentanyl. But then as time goes on, the Chinese government steps in and regulates who can make fentanyl. And meanwhile, the Mexican trafficking world has figured out how to make it. Mm-hmm. And so what ends up happening by 2017, 18, you really begin to see the chemicals coming from the ingredient chemicals coming from China, but fentanyl is really not coming from China so much. Okay. By 2019, that shut down. And in Mexico, they definitely have learned how to make it. In Mexico, and from China, they were sending it, the companies were sending it through the mail, a pound at a time or something like that. With Mexico, though, in charge of making it, you began to see just a far more complete coverage. They were making so much more of it. They were making it with the ingredients that they buy from China, and they were smuggling huge amounts of it now too. So you couldn't really cover the country. Chinese chemical companies could not cover the country with fentanyl the way the Mexicans have, because they were sending it through the mail. It really requires like truckloads. And
they were sending it to like these low-level dealers, right?
Yes.
It was a small operations because it was easy to make fentanyl.
Yes.
They were used. You talk about this thing called the magic blender.
The magic bullet.
The magic bullet blender. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, the magic bullet was used by the street dealers early on because fentanyl promised like lottery-sized profits, but in order to get there, you had to mix fentanyl with something else because it's so potent that just a few grains of the stuff will make you high, and a couple more will kill you. So and no one's selling little grains of this stuff on the street. That's not logistically possible. You have to mix it with something else, with some kind of other powder, inert powder. And so they began to realize that was the case. And a kind of a legend, a myth started or was already in place that held that the best way to mix your stuff was with a magic bullet blender. Turns out a magic bullet blender is the worst way. It's a great machine. We own one, great for smoothies. But it has a blade, and you don't mix powders with a blade. That's for mixing liquids. And so the mixes became really bad, and you began to see these huge numbers of overdoses in Cincinnati, in Akron, in Huntington, West Virginia, various places where you just would not see people. You would see like dozens of people overdosing in a weekend, that kind of thing. The Mexicans more or less solved that problem by doing better mixing, but also by, as you say, packaging fentanyl into counterfeit pills later on. This is really the last 2-3 years. And so you've got all these people making the stuff down there, packaging it into pills now it's by the tens of millions, I have to say. It just sounds ridiculous how much of that stuff is coming through now. But it really just gets down to the mere fact that they are able to make so much fentanyl.
Yeah, and you package it as pills, and that people have already been kind of conditioned to take pills and to sort of like trust pills as like a, because of OxyContin. So it doesn't seem as dangerous somehow.
But also there are people who are already addicted to pills. And the truth is, at this point in their lives, they don't really care what they're using so long as it keeps the dope sickness away. And these pills have fentanyl in it. So, and they're cheap,
So what do they think they're buying when they're buying those pills? Do they think they're buying OxyContin?
Initially, they thought they were buying the pill that it looked like. So a Percocet.
Yeah.
An oxycodone generic. But I think now so many people are addicted, they know there's nothing legit about the pills that they're buying. And what's more, the price will show you that you're buying a phony pill. It's like the guy who sells you a Rolex for $50. That Rolex is not a Rolex. It's some knockoff, right? Well, the same is true of the pills. If the real pills on the street now would be like $80 a pill, $40 to $80, let's say, and these pills are going for $2.
Wow.
Well, why? And particularly if those folks are, folks are on the street, they know this stuff. That it's not like a mystery. It does become a problem though when these pills are sold, because they're in such enormous quantities. These pills are sold by younger dealers on social media apps like Snapchat, TikTok, stuff like that. And the people who buy for them are also very young and frequently don't have any background or any tolerance, certainly to fentanyl. And that is when it becomes a real serious issue. A lot of kids have died from thinking they were buying a Xanax bar or a Percocet or an oxycodone generic, and really what they were buying from some dealer on Snapchat was a pill made in Mexico that contains only fentanyl.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very high-profile case right, up the street from where I am here in LA. This high school girl thought she was in her bathroom, or the school bathroom, and took a pill and died immediately. I think there's a question that us laymen have who are not in the drug world of why are all these things laced with fentanyl? Well, you're sort of explaining it here. It's very cheap to make, right? It makes things more potent. It's
also a way of addicting someone who is, say you're selling cocaine and you have cocaine buyers who, buy from you every few days or every weekend or whatever. Well, you start putting fentanyl in the cocaine, and pretty soon those folks are going to be addicted to cocaine. To fentanyl, which means they have to buy every day. This is no longer a recreational kind of thing. This is a daily habit, a daily addiction. And there is some people push back saying, no, it's most likely unintentional. It's sloppy mixing. My feeling is that probably was the case early on in this story. But now you see fentanyl and cocaine everywhere. People dying of fentanyl and the cocaine everywhere. And it's been going on now for years. And I just think you cannot explain that by a few sloppy mixers. You know what I mean? You need the business of drugs is a serious business about making money. And if it makes you some money, you're gonna do it. And it seems like, I've had enough people telling me this, but also seems like it's so widespread that people understand the money-making aspect of adding fentanyl to other drugs. It's really insidious and devious that they know what's happening. They know it can kill you, but it's still. But a lot of these folks are people who now the dealer who's selling it may not know what's in it. Yeah. You know what I mean? And also that dealer may well be selling the drug to support his own habit. I think that's frequently the case. And there's a lot of stories out there. There's a whole lot of stories, and there's variations on a theme that can go for days. I'm just saying that it makes a business sense to do it that way. And I always err on the side of these folks being all about business, the money, and what makes them money and what reduces their risk. All right. I want to also talk about methamphetamine. This is an interesting drug because it's changed. The meth of the past that we knew that was like a party drug, apparently. You say there was a new thing, the P2P. Explain this to me. The meth that is out in the streets now is very different, and we're going to talk about why that makes such a difference. But how did meth change? Meth is meth. Yeah. But it used to be that it was made with ephedrine. Mm-hmm. which is found in decongestants, right? It's a Sudafed pills, all that stuff. And easy to do that, easy to make that meth out of that stuff. And the Mexican trafficking world became proficient and sophisticated in meth production through the ephedrine method for many years, the 80s into the 90s, into the mid 2000s. But then the Mexican government controlled, regulated the amount of ephedrine imported into Mexico. And there were so many people in that world by then that they needed a new way of making it. They just couldn't get access on the as much and as easily as they used to. So they switched to a method that was new for them, an old method, but new for them, called the P2P method, involving an ingredient known as a main ingredient in this production method known as phenyl to propanone, P2P. And this method is really very much more messy and difficult and smelly, but it does have one benefit to a trafficker, and that is you can make P2P many, many different ways with a variety of different kinds of chemicals. And as you make P2P, as the government cracks down on this way of making it, you can just simply switch to another, because the chemicals that you're using to make this chemical itself are very widely available. They're industrial, they're cheap, they're easily to get, and by the way, they're also toxic. And so this method began to take over after this regulation in 2008 in Mexico, and really began to amp up as the learning curve, as they mastered the learning curve on how to make it by like 2011, 12, 13, right in there is kind of when I kind of view that this is when they really began producing massive quantities, and they began to realize that they could get all the ingredients from other parts of the world through these shipping ports on the western side of Mexico that are so important in all this story. And so this, what began to happen, and certainly about 2013, you began to see meth just completely own LA. Skid Row, It was just a meth central, dethrones crack as the Skid Row drug of choice. You know, all the West Coast, really, 2013, 14, 15, you're seeing it. You're seeing it in 2017 in the Midwest, and all these small scale little meth cooks are run right out of business by this stuff. It's just too potent and too cheap. And then finally, meth ends up in New England, all produced out of Mexico, of course, ends up in New England, which never had any meth to speak of at all.
Right.
At the same time, though, what is also happening, and this was kind of, this is what I first reported. I think it was, my book was the first to report on this. It's also accompanied by rapid onset symptoms of schizophrenia in users. So intense paranoia, delusions, inability to kind of rule one's life, and very quickly someone's homeless. Very quickly someone's in a tent and acting out and up all night and seeing monsters, seeing people who are trying to, scary paranoia, people trying to kill you, and FBI agents, and every black car that passes you must be coming for you, and all this kind of stuff. And it really begins to do this in every place. The remarkable thing is that every place you go and talk to people where this meth ended up, and it's pretty much now across the country, you are seeing these rapid onset symptoms of schizophrenia, intense meth-induced psychosis, mental illness, inability to rule one's life, and all that kind of stuff. And this is now in New England. It's now in many parts of the Midwest where you're seeing this meth. You're seeing also these folks kind of, you know, and it's really, in my opinion, been a major driver behind the spread and the increased numbers of homeless that you see all across the country, homeless people all across the country. Very intense driver, I think, also of mental illness and of tent encampments. All of that kind of stuff moves across the country with this methamphetamine over the last, 10 years or so, starting in, of course, Skid Row.
I mean, this is where your book really just opened my eyes. And, I live in Hollywood, so
you must see this every day.
This is in my literally in my backyard. Well, not in my backyard, but it's literally like 2 blocks away. There's encampments. There's, homeless people, I'm telling you the stories. But a guy came out to our street the other day and just dropped his pants and took off a diaper. I mean, lots of, and of course in LA and all the major cities, there's a lot of debate, how did this happen? How did this happen? Why are there so many homeless people? And I know that it's a complicated issue, but the kind of narrative that we're constantly fed is we need to home these people or don't have housing, right? There's like a housing crisis, and that is part of the problem. But I
It
think
is.
nobody talks about what your book talks about, which is that, everybody's like, oh, there's a mental health crisis happening. Yes, but the thing is, a lot of this mental health, it's not like they were mentally ill before they became homeless. It's like the drugs that they're taking are making them mentally ill. So when you see these people screaming in the middle of the street, there's a good chance, it sounds to me, like they might be on meth at that moment.
I would say there's a very good chance of that. And here's the thing. You are correct to point out that for a long time, the narrative has been only about the cause of homelessness is lack of affordable housing.
Right.
The solution, the way you solve, quote unquote, solve homelessness is through providing more affordable housing. There is no doubt that housing costs are part of this story, but there are many reasons why people go homeless. Many.
Yeah.
Domestic violence, being released from prison without any family to help you out, aging out of foster care, eviction, a surgery you can't afford, a job loss, and part of this is housing. Sure, I would say just as much. It seems to me to be drug addiction. Drug addiction is a major driver of this stuff. But the other point is this. So there are many reasons why you're homeless, but once you are homeless, for whatever the original reason, methamphetamine, particularly in the western side of the United States, but really pretty much all across the country, is in such vast supply that people very quickly turn to it because it allows you to deal with homelessness. You forget, you kind of are separated from your grim reality. You're up all night so you can protect yourself against beatings or rape or theft. And once you begin to use methamphetamine, regardless of the reason why you were originally homeless, it's very, very difficult to get off that stuff and very difficult to get back into housing. And in fact, what you find, I think homeless outreach workers who go into tent encampments looking to help people will say this over and over and over, that they often offer housing, treatment, et cetera, and people in the encampment say, no, I don't want that. And there's all kinds of rationales and so on, but frequently the truth is no one wants to be away from the dope.
Yeah.
The dope has taken over the self-preservation instinct, essentially. That's why you find people in really cold weather still staying in the tents. I'm living in Nashville now, and all through the Midwest, find people doing that. People saying, no, you can stay in the tent and going the frostbite, losing digits or whatever, freezing to death, et cetera.
It's incredible. You mentioned that one of the other symptoms that I had never heard about until I read your book of the meth, of the psychosis created by meth, is this hoarding, this wanting to hoard stuff. And, sometimes when you're going by encampments, you see so much junk and you're like, what is all that junk? There's just so much stuff, garbage.
Right.
And
exactly. And that is in part brought on by meth. There's all these weird ways your mind starts thinking, like, I'm sure I'm going to need that a coffee table someday. And you're up all night and you're thinking all kinds of weird stuff. And so that ends up being kind of like a symptomatic kind of manifestation of using meth and particularly using the meth that's made now out of Mexico. I want to say this though. I want to make, when I was writing this book, nobody was paying attention to this issue. Nobody. I could not find anybody. Even people who dealt with it daily really hadn't given it much serious thought. My feeling was it's possible that this was because of the enormous potency of the meth coming out of Mexico, which is unprecedented. It's so much more potent than any other meth before. It's also possible that there may be chemicals that are in the meth that aren't being tested for that may cause this. And so I think now, a year later, since the book came out, a lot of people have been paying more attention to why there's so much psychosis and so much deep and intense and very difficult psychosis that's very difficult to get people out of. And this is you're seeing people pay more attention to it now. And I think what is generally being concluded is that the meth is simply so much more potent that meth has never been this potent.
Yeah.
And meth-induced psychosis is a known thing. People know this is but nobody has ever seen it this much and this intensely. And so the general consensus, and I'm going to go along with whatever people can prove scientifically. I was not saying I know why this is happening. I'm just telling you that these are the symptoms that are very clearly happening all across the country. And now I'm waiting for people to kind of tell me, okay, we think it's this. And I think what generally people are saying now is that it's just the intense potency that people are finding this meth coming in.
Yeah. And I was shocked to hear that it can take, like 6 to 9 months to recover from that kind of that addiction to that potent meth. I mean, really, it's not like, okay, you can recover in like a week. Like it's seriously, no. And that's terrifying because there's so many people that are addicted to this stuff across the country. All right. I want to get to a little bit more of a positive, at least if there is a positive side, because your book does offer examples of, positive developments in this crisis that we're in. Obviously you're just a journalist. You're reporting on what you see.
Yes.
But tell me, some of the things that you have seen that give you at least a little bit of faith that this maybe can turn around in some way.
I think that there's lots of things out there that I think are fascinating to watch. And I think generally speaking, though, overall, it's when Americans begin to act at the most local level and in the smallest level possible. I think we got into this because we wanted magic answers. We still kind of want magic answers to complicated problems, And one of them was, well, how do we deal with human pain? Well, magic answers, cure everybody will be opioid painkillers for every single human being, no matter the background, no matter the problem, et cetera, et cetera. And that gets us into problems that we're still living with and have been devastating. My feeling is that where I really see the most exciting stuff is when people understand that it's on the smallest level. Finding people to put together start a small business, 2-3 employees in a place that doesn't really have any, that kind of thing. Not looking for the big factory with 500 jobs, but more like the small business with 2 jobs or 3, and then somebody else doing the same. And you begin to see these little beachheads towards some other narrative, rather than let's get high all day and live on the street and whatever. And to me, this is the great insight, I guess, we should take from this epidemic of addiction that's been bedeviling us now for a generation, basically. And so I just think that there's so many of these small stories out there. The problem is they're not sexy. Yeah. The problem is they don't show results immediately. And we are used to, we want immediate gratification. We want immediate results. If something doesn't cure a problem immediately, well, what was the point? It was probably it's just a waste of taxpayers' money. So and I also believe that the reason for the book being called The Least of Us is because I think the epidemic is showing us that we're only as strong as the most vulnerable. We're only as strong as the least of us, as those and most in need. And so it's when you find people at the smallest, most community level who are making tiny steps towards making life a little bit easier, a community a little bit easier to live in, at the park, a little bit better place for kids to play. It's that kind of thing. Now, all of that, is tough because it takes a long time. On the other hand, it really is effective. Yeah. And it's the kind of thing that brings about results that don't have unintended consequences of the kind the opioid epidemic has left us with. And so the last chapter, for example, of the book is about Portsmouth, Ohio. Portsmouth is a town that I wrote about at length in Dreamland. It's where the Dreamland swimming pool is, and I'll leave it to your listeners to read Dreamland to understand the importance of that swimming pool to this much larger story. It's a very, very important thing, I think. But, if you look at what's happening in Portsmouth, I just find that fascinating, man. It's just like, you see all these people who are sick to death of being the fattest county, the poorest county, the county with the highest diabetes and the highest rates of smoking. And so what you're finding is these small little nucleuses and these synergies of energy among people who are like-minded. And now you have a bunch of new businesses, all small. You have a couple of outdoor cafes, which is like an unheard of thing in that town, a place you can meet people outdoors. Not since the pool closed in Dreamland Pool closed in 93 have they had such a place, really, to meet and just hang out and say hello, how you doing, la, 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 all that. And then you've got CrossFits now where people are working out together. It's like this small repair of community.
So you're talking about what is the root cause of people getting on meth in the first place. They feel not connected to anything, right? There's a lot of reasons, but one reason is that this lack of community, this lack of feeling like they belong to anything.
Yes.
Right. And just a feeling of complete despair and hopelessness, especially in poor communities.
And then when the drugs do arrive, there's the community connection was a bulwark, was a real defense. It was a bulwark against this crap. And when you shred that, and you shred it in poor communities, Rust Belt communities, but also well-to-do suburbs where no one knows one another and everyone kind of lives alone and it's kind of sad, soulless isolation. The same thing is true there too. It's not like this is only in the poor areas. I think this is all over the country, and that's why it makes us particularly. I don't live in a particularly
poor area, and yet it's like you can have like a $3 million house, and a block away there's an encampment.
Yeah,
it's incredible the disparity, and we just drive by it.
We become inured to it because my feeling is, it's an interesting thing that you mentioned, because my feeling is we don't feel we know how
Seems
to
hopeless.
solve it.
Yeah.
We don't know what to do. And my feeling is that the way you find solutions is not with some broad brush magic bullet answer to everything. It's to find the solutions in the smallest ways, working with people who are like-minded. For example, a church was a guy from one church was asking me, and I don't know, this is kind of my own hunches here, saying our foster children agency is just overwhelmed with kids, how can we fix our foster children agency? And I thought to him, well, how about instead of trying to fix the foster children agency, your church adopt, in some kind of financial way, a couple of kids. Small, do it in a small way, and then move towards maybe something bigger. It's when we try to solve things on a broad scale, it's very difficult to do. It's very complicated. We end up losing faith and energy and giving up and saying, oh, there's no hope. But the hope comes turning away from those big magic bullet answers. That's dope talking, in my opinion. Oh, you can have it all. Everything's possible. That's nonsense. It seems to me like we need to find ways of just moving forward in small ways and each person putting their own granito de arena, as we used to say, as they say in Mexico, little grain of sand, and to me, that is a really important. To me, that was the important insight, hopeful insight to come out of this, that we have this in us because we all were evolved with a deep need, not a desire for, a deep need for community. That's how we survived as a species, in groups, not alone.
Right. We're not engineered. That's not how our brains work. But then this drug is so insidious because it makes you a loner. Both drugs. Yep. They make you loners.
And all drugs do that. I first saw the effect on our instinct for self-preservation in the Bowery when I was 10, when we were living in New York for a brief time. The Bowery, which was just nothing but drunks and people who have given up everything to follow alcohol and live in the trash and the coldest weather and all that kind of stuff. All drugs will do it. It's just that meth and fentanyl, particularly together, but also apart, just are so prevalent and so potent. They just seem to do it in this masterful way. And so we need to find ways of rekindling the small local initiatives that bring people together who can in the end not have to pay attention to all this nonsense on Twitter or Fox News or CNN that says the message of which is, you're right, everybody else is bad.
Yeah.
To me, these are radical ideas that are in insights that are emerging from this very, very nasty stuff. It's very much like fossil fuel, right? Mm-hmm. From decay comes energy. And, and I think that's kind of that is to me, what's possible. It's whether or not we'll listen, whether or not we'll act, all that kind of stuff is really kind of the question, I guess, that we're left with.
Are there, I hate to even ask this, But, okay, so when you first started, you were following OxyContin, then it became meth and fentanyl. Do you see another drug coming down the pike that's even worse? It seems like it just gets worse and worse. I can't imagine anything being worse.
I'm not sure. I hate to predict the future. I didn't predict fentanyl.
Yeah.
Just because you write a book. I mean, journalists really need to be wary of predicting the future. But there is the chemical literature is filled with many attempts by legitimate companies to invent opioids that would take the place of morphine.
Right.
They didn't work out, and they're not commercially viable for whatever reason, but they're still out there in the chemical literature. And there's several that have made an appearance in the last 5 years, not in very large, not in very large amounts, but nevertheless have shown up. Whether it'll take fentanyl's place, I don't know. I mean, fentanyl, literally, it's in Skid Row, LA. It's in Maine.
Right.
It's every place in between.
It seems intractable at this moment in time. It seems.
But it seems so. Let me tell you this. I think that the reason it seems so is also because this is very important. It seems to me that this has graduated from a drug problem to an issue, a problem of state, of international diplomacy. And neither the United States nor Mexico has ever done anything about the Mexico is scandalously unwilling to do anything about this. Right. We, on the other hand, are, I think, scandalously unwilling to do anything about the flow of guns south into Mexico. And I can tell you that is a major reason why those cartels down there enjoy the impunity that they do enjoy, and are able to fight each other. It's just supply. The supply is the thing, and when it comes to drugs or whether it comes to guns, it's a toxic influence. And I think we are seeing the effect of just simply not doing anything about it, either Mexico or the United States.
Well, thank goodness there are people like you around, at least, casting some light on this for us, because I mean,
who's just as lost as everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, right? Yeah, I didn't expect you to come up with answers, but I mean, it's important that it comes to light and people understand really what's going on. And so I so appreciate your dogged reporting. Are you allowed to talk about what you're working on right now?
Really, I'm not working. I'm trying to write magazine stories.
Yeah.
I did write a story about this very topic for LA Magazine in October, a great article about Skid Row. If you want to post that up somewhere,
I will. I will link to that, because that was the article that really put you on my radar. I had read your stuff, but that was I send it to everybody I knew, because I was like, that's the first honest story I read about homelessness in Los Angeles. In ever. Right. Nobody ever writes honestly about
that. I really started as a breaking news reporter. I started doing, and I've done books in the last 10 years, but it's kind of like it doesn't satisfy my inner, breaking news reporter where I have a byline every few days or something like that. So I'm trying to do more shorter stuff and not a book every 4 years. I'll get back to books too. I love doing them, but for the moment I'm a little worn out. So we'll see.
Well, Sam, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and talking about this important topic.
John, I really appreciate it, man. Thanks so much for the thoughtful questions. And it's really great of you to have such interest in my work. I so appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for listening to the show, everyone. If you enjoyed what you heard and you'd like to support the show, there are a few ways you can do so. One is to go to my Patreon page. That's Right About Now Podcast at Patreon, Patreon, and give a slight donation. It goes a long way towards making this podcast as professional and helpful as possible. You can also subscribe to my Substack newsletter at Small Talk. And you can find me over at Instagram at Right About Now Podcast and on Facebook at Right About Now Podcast. Until we meet again, this is John Small, encouraging you all to do the right thing.